Welcome back to Behind the Play. My name is Alex Adams, and I'm very excited to introduce Howard Beck, who is a contributor for the Locked On Network and GQ. Howard has had a tremendous career working for the New York Times, LA Daily News, Sports Illustrated, and much more. And I've loved his work for a long time. And so I really appreciate you, Howard, coming on and taking the time.
No, absolutely my pleasure, Alex. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
I first want to ask you a little bit for the listeners that might not know is Zach Lowe always talks about the three most anticipated words in niche basketball podcasting. What up, Beck? I want to ask you what the origin story of that is and why people address you that way sometimes.
Yeah, it's a fun story with a tinge of sadness attached to it because it comes from Kobe Bryant. Zach first used that line not as the opener to the podcast, but this is back in his Grantland days, I'm pretty sure. So we're talking like 9 or 10 years ago, I think, whenever the first time I went on his podcast. And I think I was even talking on that podcast about maybe some Shaq and Kobe retrospective that I had done, something that was tapping into my old history covering the Lakers as a beat writer, which I did from 1997 to 2004. And so Zach was noting before we got into it all, he's like, I always remember this moment. And the funny thing when he says this is like, I do not remember this moment or did not until he brought it up. But during the NBA lockout, the labor shutdown in 2011, we're bouncing all over the city around Midtown Manhattan. The NBA and the union are negotiating at this hotel and that hotel. And sometimes we're in a lobby. Sometimes we're staked out on a sidewalk. We always stakeouts for months on end during the lockout, trying to track the negotiations. And then eventually the Players Association brought in all their players, right? They negotiate with a small subgroup, right? Their executive committee, but sometimes you bring in the entire membership to discuss, here's what's on the table, here's what we're considering. So at some point they brought in, probably not all 450 players, but hundreds of players to the Sheraton in Midtown Manhattan. And what Zach was recalling was we're waiting in the lobby, and as the players finish their meeting and they're filtering through, Kobe walks out looking very Kobe, just kind of that swagger, that strut, and he's got sunglasses on. And in Zach's recollection, he sees me, and I don't remember if the sunglasses actually get tipped down in like Hollywood fashion or whatever. And he just says, "What up, Beck?" And Zach brought it up on the pod all these years ago because he just thought that was this cool moment of recognition. Obviously, like I'd covered Kobe since his second year in the league. Like I'd covered him every day for 7 years. So obviously we knew each other a little bit. Zach just thought that was such a cool little moment. And so he says it. And then every subsequent time I've been on the pod since then, he just decided I've got to open with "What up, Beck?" And so, yeah, it really starts with Kobe back in 2011.
And I want to ask about kind of you as a basketball writer. When did you first think you might want to become one?
So it's funny because I've often said there's nothing about my career, especially my NBA writing career, which is now in its 26th season that I just completed, that may really makes any sense. A lot of people come into the NBA writing and NBA media today having thought at some young age, that's what I want to do. I love it. I love basketball. I love the NBA. I want to write about the NBA or talk about the NBA or analyze the NBA for a living. That's not my path. I didn't set out to be here. It's a little bit of a happy accident. Okay. Back when I graduated college in 1991, at that time, this is pretty much pre-internet. The newspapers are the primary place to get a job covering sports or to get a job covering almost anything, frankly. And at that time, if you aspire to cover professional sports, the NBA, Major League Baseball, NFL, you got to get to a paper that covers those teams first in one of those markets. And then probably you're starting off covering like high school football and basketball, or maybe you get to cover junior colleges or Division I, whatever it may be. But the path toward covering professional sports, because that's the pinnacle, right? Those are the hardest beats to get. There aren't that many of them, and somebody gets them and they hang on for years. So they're hard to come by back in the day. Then there was no internet. There were no blogs. There were no alternate routes. Maybe you went into radio or TV instead. But if you were a writer and reporter who wanted to come up the way that I did, which was I read Sports Illustrated as a kid. I read my hometown newspaper, the San Jose Mercury News, their sports section as a kid, and I wanted to do that. The way to do that was to go to newspaper. and there's no guarantee you're ever going to get to cover the beat that you want. And the first like major beat that opens up might actually be a sport you didn't aspire to cover, right? Like if you were working for, let's say, the San Jose Mercury News, my hometown paper, if I had gotten there out of college, say, and my big thing was I wanted to cover the 49ers. I was a huge NFL fan as a kid. And if the first job they'd said, well, I'm sorry, the Niners beat is not available, but come in, cover this other thing, and then maybe a couple of years in, they say, oh, hey, our Sharks guy just left. You want to cover the Sharks? Well, I don't know anything about hockey, but okay, fine. The Sharks got to San Jose long after I had graduated high school. Unfortunately, if they had come along 10, 15 years earlier, who knows? I might have grown up a big hockey fan. Yeah. But you take whatever's available. So in my case, I was a big NFL fan. I became a massive sports fan in the time of the Niners dynasty of the 1980s. Joe Montana to Dwight Clark is my seminal moment as a young sports fan. That's kind of the thing that really hooks me, that gets me wanting to devour the sports section every day and reading Sports Illustrated, and eventually sets me on the path toward, when I'm starting to think about college, like, oh, hey, people get paid to go watch games and then write about it. Like, that's ridiculous. Maybe I can do that. I mean, it's literally like my little, teenage pea brain. That's how I thought about it. And I went to college at UC Davis, which is near Sacramento, and worked for the college paper there. I was an English major because they don't have a journalism department there. But I knew I wanted to be a sports writer, and I wrote for the college paper every day. And I built myself up, built up my resume and my writing skills, and tried to hone, my craft and all that stuff. And then I take a winding path where I've bounced in my early career. I bounced between sports and news multiple times. Okay. I thought at one point I was not going to go back to sports. I thought news is what matters. I was kind of like leaving sports behind. And in 1997, I'm working for the Ventura County Star, covering local government. And my former editor from a different paper is now at the LA Daily News, and calls me one day out of the blue and says, hey, I don't know if you have any thoughts of coming back to sports again. And at this point, I'm in Ventura, so I'm like an hour and a half, 2 hours away from LA. So I'm right up the road. And he says, our Laker beat opened up. Fun footnote, the Laker beat opened up because a guy named Mark Stein, who your listeners probably are aware of, Mark Stein had left the LA Daily News earlier that year to go to the Dallas Morning News. He was there for many years before he eventually goes to ESPN, of course. And I didn't know Stein at all back then. But so they had a vacancy, and this sports editor, his name is Michael Anastasi, who I'd worked for before in Davis, said, you should come in if you're interested. Because we knew each other, he was like, I'm going to take myself out of the process, but you'll interview with the deputy sports editor and then the editor-in-chief of the paper and the managing editor, and they'll decide, but I'm just getting you through the door if you're interested. And the funny thing, and I will admit it, I wasn't sure. I actually hesitated. And to set the stage here for your listeners again, 1997. So Shaq and Kobe have just completed, or are about to complete. It was the spring, so they were still going. That was their first year together. They had drafted or made the trade for Kobe's draft rights the previous summer. They had signed Shaq away from Orlando that previous summer. And I was not an avid NBA fan or NBA follower. Like I watched it like a casual fan. My primary sport still as a fan was the NFL. But this was an opportunity, and obviously a really great one, but I had kind of shut off that part of my brain. I really wasn't sure I wanted to go back to sports. And then I had a couple of friends who were like, are you effing crazy? Like, of course you should go do this. Do you realize who they have on the, I'm like, yeah, I know who they have. Like, I'm aware, I'm reading, but like, I just kind of had picked a direction with my career, and I thought I was going to stick with that. So, I did ponder for a little bit, but I did go down and interview. And it went well enough, obviously, and I got the job. And frankly, at the moment that I got it, I was probably in over my head. I hadn't covered a professional sports beat before. I had done plenty of sports before, but I'd been out of sports for a few years. I'd never covered the NBA before. There was a learning curve for sure. But I'm still doing this 26 years later, so I guess I did okay.
Did you fall in love with the game like at a certain period of time? What was like the biggest challenge for you as well to kind of when you started?
So I in my childhood, I'm more of an NFL fan and a little bit of a baseball fan, right? But I did watch, like as a Bay Area kid, I remember watching the Warriors. In fact, I won a contest at a children's shoe store once where I got to be ball boy for a day at a Warriors game. I was like 8, 9 years old. And I do have this memory of they gave me like this the bright yellow t-shirt, whatever the Warriors had, matching the bright yellow they had back in the day. And I remember sweeping the key, and I remember rebounding during warmups and stuff. Like I have this vague recollection of this. And I'd been to a couple Warriors games, but they were like way down the pecking order in the Bay Area in the 70s and 80s. The Niners and Raiders, Giants and A's, those teams were reigned supreme in the public consciousness. The Warriors it was almost like having a minor league team back then. And it's not that they didn't have a loyal following in the Bay Area and especially in Oakland, but they weren't as big of a presence, and they weren't very good for most of that. And during the 90s, so now I'm in my 20s in the 90s. I mean, I watched all of the Bulls runs, right? Like I was, like everybody else in the country or around the world, who, if you weren't a fan of another team, you kind of became a de facto Michael Jordan and Bulls fan. I loved watching the Bulls. So like I did watch a bunch of the NBA finals. I remember watching, Magic Johnson in the All-Star game, after the HIV diagnosis. I remember, a variety of playoffs along the way, but I was not that avid and of course back then, no satellite TV, no league pass.
Yeah.
But I do remember watching NBA and NBC. I remember watching some of the national games. I remember watching, some Sacramento Kings when I was living up that way, some Warriors when I was growing up. But I think it's more you start covering the sport and and now I'm appreciating it from a different standpoint, right? I have no emotional investment in any particular franchise or players. So it's more of, this is my job and you have to be all invested. And so, I'm consuming as much of it as possible and learning as much as possible about not just the game, but how to cover the game, how to work a beat, how to establish a network of I don't want to say sources necessarily, because that sounds like, like there's almost a pejorative there, but establishing a network of people that you can talk to, who can give you insight on the game and what's going on around the league and all that. And you just learn it as you go. So to the extent that, there's a love for the game, it's more from an outsider's perspective and a reporter's perspective where, yeah, obviously I love the aesthetics of the game, the artistry of the game, the personalities of the game, and a lot of the greats that I've been fortunate to cover for the last, over a quarter century. But yeah, it was not today. I feel like a lot of people, especially younger people who have come into this space in the last 10 years, it's been through, I love the game, I want to write about the game, and then they write about it and they get good at it. They get established through a blog or whatever else, they get hired somewhere, and boom, now they're doing the thing that they wanted. Those same people, if they grew up when I did, it would have been a harder path. And I don't begrudge that at all, but it's just different now. So I do think it has changed kind of the complexion of who's covering the game now, because I think because you can work your way toward the sport you want to cover in a more assertive way in this era, I think more people who cover the game are doing it because they set out to cover the NBA specifically. Whereas I think 30 years ago, that would have been a little harder to do.
And for you, you mentioned it briefly, just how you develop, I don't want to say sources, but relationships with players and management. How deep for you over time have you built those relationships, but also been able to be critical and ask questions that are critical and to the players and management and whoever you're talking to?
It's a tricky balance, right? Like when I got hired to cover the Lakers, I'm coming in, I'm brand new to this entire environment. I'm trying to find my way, even just in terms of the logistics and the routines and the travel and the daily deadlines, because you're writing every day of the week, basically. And so I don't think about it as, how am I going to establish these relationships? It's just by the nature of the job as a beat writer, you're going to be at every practice, at every game, pregame, postgame, home, road, and you're just around them a lot. And NBA teams rosters aren't that big. They're bigger now, but when I started, it was 12 guys, plus you might have a player on injured reserve back when they actually had an injured list, right? So it's a pretty small group, plus, and even coaching staffs were smaller then. You're around them every day. It's just a natural, just like in a classroom or in a place of work or anything else, you're just around the same people a lot of the time, and you just kind of figure out personalities and you establish relationships by just multiple conversations over time. You figure out who's easier to talk to, who's harder to talk to, who to approach after a loss, who not to, maybe. And it's just human dynamics, right? Like in any other environment. I don't think it's really dramatically different. And in the course of things, you establish a rapport, and some guys more than others. And so early in my career, the Lakers had just acquired Rick Fox at that time. Derek Fisher was going into his second season as well as Kobe was. And you learn, pretty quickly that like the stars have a lot of demands on them, and the stars sometimes are going to be the ones who are going to play it a little more closer to the vest. But the role guys, the supporting cast, are usually or quite often the guys who are the most valuable to talk to and establish relationships with, because they don't have as many demands. They're more willing to talk. They don't have as much scrutiny on them, and they don't have as much backlash when they lose. And so guys like Rick Fox, Derek Fisher, Robert Ory, Derek Harper, Ron Harper, Horace Grant, Brian Shaw, like these were all guys who, and it's not to diminish the role that Shaq and Kobe played, but like these guys, the group I just mentioned, they're all really smart about the game. They're really just like, they were high character guys. It's always struck me in the years since I covered the Lakers, how many of the players I covered either became broadcasters, coaches, or both. And I think it speaks to, like, Tyronn Lue is another one. It speaks to a certain level of basketball intelligence, emotional intelligence, communication skills, because you can't do those jobs as broadcasting and coaching and broadcasting unless you have those attributes. And so I was fortunate enough to cover all of these guys who I thought were really, good to talk to, enjoyed the conversations, and they enjoyed the give and take, and it helped me a lot in my job. So that's a lot of it. And then, you encounter other people along the way. And for those first 7 years, I'm covering the Lakers as the entirety of my job, right? When the Lakers are out, I'm not covering other series. I'm not covering the NBA finals in those years unless the Lakers are in them, but they were in 4 out of the 7 years that I covered. But the point is that I'm not necessarily networking as much with other teams because the Lakers are all consuming. And especially in that Shaq and Kobe and then Phil Jackson gets there. Like, it is all consuming. So I'm not straying too far at any given time. When I worked for the New York Times later, starting in 2004, national newspaper, LA Daily News was a local paper. New York Times is a national paper. I'm covering the Knicks. The Knicks never make the playoffs. So every time the Knicks season's over, the Times is saying, well, we're a national paper. You got to go. We need you to cover the playoffs. So they'd send me to Phoenix or Dallas or Utah, Miami, Boston, wherever. And I would make the rounds. And that's where you start to really, for me, that's where I really started to branch out more, I think, and getting, more familiarity with coaches and GMs around the league. It's not that it didn't happen during those LA years, but those, I'm telling you, like, the Lakers beat was all consuming. And back then, if you were a beat writer, you were pretty much just solely focused on your beat. You weren't concerned with the rest of the league's drama and politics and moves.
Is that something that you've seen differently now, where beat writers are more focused around the general NBA?
A little bit more. It feels like everybody is kind of like simultaneously local and national, and everybody's expected to kind of have a beat on everything at all times. And I think beat writers want to move on more quickly now too. Like it used to be like beat writers would be covering a team 10, 15, 20, 30 years. I think those spans are shorter these days. And I think people want to, it's a really taxing job. Like, it's a fun job, but it's a very exhausting lifestyle. I did it for 16 years in a row, Lakers to Knicks. And that was, by the time I stopped doing that, I was ready to get off that hamster wheel. It's a lot of travel. It's a lot of games. It's a lot of practices. It's a lot of stories. And so I don't begrudge anybody who wants to like do that for 5, 6, 7 years, maybe. And then, become a national writer, if you can find the opportunity.
What would you say is, other than What Up, Beck, is maybe the most fondest memory of your career?
Oh man, fondest. There's a couple different ways I could go with that, I guess. And, of course, over 26 years, there's a lot of different things. The first Lakers championship, people look at as kind of this, like it was a given now. And looking back through time, when you look at the dynasty of Shaq and Kobe, 3 straight championships, like the only three-peat other than the Bulls in the last however many decades now. And it feels like, well, of course they did. They're 2 of the top 5 players in the league and 2 of the top players of all time. But yeah, Portland, the first year, they're down 15 points in the 4th quarter of Game 7 of the conference finals. They are literally minutes from possibly having their season end after a 67-win season, their first year under Phil Jackson. And going into that year, all the preseason predictions, the odds, everything, were all pointing to either San Antonio winning again or Portland, or it was everybody else. The Lakers were in the mix, but they were not necessarily considered the favorites. The 67-win season was itself a surprise. And everybody said when Phil Jackson arrived that, oh, it takes time to learn the triangle offense. Year one is just going to be kind of acclimating. By year two, maybe they're going to be more of a contender. And they had flamed out a couple times before Phil Jackson got there. Kobe was still really young. And so they were not necessarily expected to win it all. And so part of that season, the fun of it was seeing it come together, seeing how quickly they evolved. And then just one of the all-time moments or memories in my career, and just in terms of like amazing games that I've covered, that fourth quarter comeback against the Trailblazers from 15 down in literally game 7 of the conference finals is just this wild moment. And all the way through, of course, the Kobe to Shaq lob, something that I wrote an oral history about for Bleacher Report a couple of years ago. So that's one of my big memories. I just think that game, that night, that series was incredible. Their series against the Kings 2 years later, which also went 7 games in the conference finals, also won in game 7, in that case overtime on the road. Like those are just incredible memories. Robert Horry's shot, in game 4 of that series after the Vlade tip out. And it's different when you cover a team on a day-to-day basis and get to see their highest highs and lowest lows, because you have a feel for who they are as people and what it means to them. And you have a sense of them in a different way. So like, all right, I've covered all these Warriors championships. I've been there for all of those. I've been there for all of LeBron's championships. The Spurs titles, the Raptors title. I've been there for all of these, and I've written about them all, but I feel like there's a certain intimacy, for lack of a better term, but that you have as writer to a team when you're there every single day. And so even for me, I always say this, like I'm not emotionally invested. I don't care if they win or lose. I have to write and make deadline. That's all that I care about. I want to write a great story. I hope I've got good material to work with, right? You're rooting for the story, not for teams. But I have a different sense of these guys if I'm covering them every day. And so those stick a little bit more in my memory, because I felt like there's a different kind of investment. It's a work investment. It's a relationship investment, and it's a time investment. And it's a little bit more fun in a way than being there, kind of coming in from parachuting in and having a little bit more distance between you. And I've gotten to know Steph over time, and I've gotten to know LeBron over time, and I've gotten to know Kevin Durant a little less so, but like, so there's still something there, but it's not the same as covering a team every day and watching them get from point A to B to C to being champions or 3-time champions.
I want to ask now a little bit about being a kind of an NBA writer, but not on the beat. And in terms of your voting, obviously you vote on awards such as MVP and All NBA. And I think yesterday you had a podcast with Zach Lowe on your All NBA votes. But I want to ask you about how, as someone in the media, how you feel about your vote being tied to player contracts. And in your mind, is there another way for player contracts to be impacted that is not through the media's vote in something like the All NBA?
For the majority of my time covering the NBA, the postseason awards had a nominal impact, if any, on player salaries. Maybe somebody's got a bonus for All-Star, but we weren't involved in the All-Star voting. We are now at 50% of the vote, but for decades, All-Star voting was purely by the fans, right? And then the coaches would pick the reserves. And so maybe a guy had a bonus for All NBA or MVP or whatever, but for the most part, like NBA bonuses don't mean that much in the grand scheme of things with those contracts. What changed, and what you're alluding to, is that a couple CBAs ago, in an effort to try to create more inducement for players to stay with their teams, superstars to stay with their teams, they started creating all these like supermax type deals. And one version of that is tied to whether you make the All NBA team or get certain other awards. And if you achieve these certain plateaus or these certain awards in the span of a certain number of years, the contract you're eligible for is literally worth 30, 40 million more now than it would have been. That particular feature Wasn't the case when I first started covering the NBA and for most of my time covering it. So in the past, okay, was there a bonus here or there? Fine. Yes. If people want to say that there's always been an influence to an extent, but not like this, not 30, 40 million, like serious money. And the NBA and the Players Association did this for obvious reasons. Well, the league wanted teams to have more tools to keep their stars. The union liked the idea that the best players could earn even more money. They're never going to turn down a system in which they're eligible for even more money. So they did it. Now, left out of this equation in this conversation, we're us, the media, the 100 people. It used to be more than that, but now 100 people who vote on the awards. Nobody asked, how do you guys feel about this? Because we would have said, oh my God, please no, please don't. Please do not put anybody's finances or their futures or their future earnings in our hands, especially to that degree. Find another way, please. But they didn't ask. I have made my case to various parties at the NBA and the union over the years saying, I wish you guys would reevaluate this and find a different path. To date, that has not happened. It's still the case. So yeah, when we sit down to fill out our ballots, especially all NBA, and this year Jaylen Brown was one of the players who that was going to make a difference for, and he got all NBA, so he's now eligible for that bigger contract. I don't want to sit down thinking about how this is going to affect Jaylen Brown, and it's got multiple layers. One, it's that much more money that Jaylen Brown can earn, so there's his fate is tied up in it. It also affects the Celtics because teams have salary caps and luxury tax thresholds that they're trying to avoid. And there's all these other limitations that come in when your salary or when your payroll reaches a certain stage. And so for the Celtics, it's both good and bad. Okay, more financial incentive for Jaylen Brown to stay. On the flip side, now our payroll is that much more bloated, and it's going to be that much harder for us to avoid the luxury tax, or that much harder to retain other talent. I don't want to be responsible as a reporter for any of that. So I wish they could find, if they're going to have a supermax and these other wrinkles in the CBA to reward guys, find a different way of measuring greatness or worthiness of that supermax that does not involve us.
I want to quickly go to a great piece you wrote for GQ that everyone should check out, which is Welcome to the NBA's Age of Chaos. And this playoffs has been wild. There's been crazy upsets. For you, what do you think is better for the league? Is it better to have this parity, or maybe super teams of old, like the teams you covered with Shaq and Kobe and LeBron and Steph and KD?
I think it's an unanswerable question to me. It's a fun conversation. There are people out there who have very strong opinions on this, and including some of my peers and some of the folks who are a little bit older than I am, who have been covering the league longer than I have, who believe, listen, the NBA has always been a league of dynasties and of super team is a little bit of a loaded phrase these days because people think of super team as like, oh, you went out and grabbed a bunch of stars and stole everybody else's talent. But teams stacked with talent, the Showtime Lakers or the 80s Celtics or the 60s Celtics, and that this has always been a league that is been controlled by a handful of teams who have been the fortunate ones to suck up some of the high level talent through whatever means, draft, free agency, trades. And that's what's best for the league, because dynasties are fun to either root for or against. They're polarizing. It gives you, they take on a different kind of legendary status, right? Like, you know, no disrespect to, say, like the 2004 Pistons or the 2019 Raptors, but when we're talking about those various eras of the NBA, we're not going to be talking about the Pistons. We'll be talking about the Lakers who preceded that championship and lost to the Pistons, or the Spurs who were building a gradual dynasty after that and beat the Pistons the following year in 2005. When we talk about the 2010s, we're going to be talking about LeBron and Steph. We're going to be talking about the Warriors. We'll talk a little bit about the Heat. Teams that win just one championship, as special as that is for that team, we don't really lionize or rhapsodize about as much, right? So this is a league of dynasties, and we kind of love them, but we also hate them when it becomes predictable, right? And we had this period of time where it was LeBron in 8 straight finals with 2 different teams, Warriors LeBron for 4 straight years. And after a while, people are like, all right, I'm ready for something new. So it really is kind of a double-edged sword. Parity, which the NBA is always kind of trying to strive toward, right? Like people can quibble about what they think about why the luxury tax or salary cap really exists, but this all does go back to the mid 80s when things were getting a little out of hand and certain teams and big markets were able to keep getting the best talent in free agency, and they were trying to create a means to make sure the talent was more evenly distributed. For better or worse, that's the idea. The salary cap is about that. The luxury tax, a lot of other wrinkles. And then in more recent years, the play-in tournament, which was trying to, it's partially an anti-tanking device, but that induces more parity. The flattened lottery odds, again, anti-tanking, but again, can contribute to more parity because now everybody, instead of being either at the very top or very bottom, there's more in the middle. And what we saw this past season and what we've seen play out in these playoffs where a 6, 7, and 8 seed all advanced for the first time ever is because we have a lot more parity than we've ever had. So to your question, good or bad, right? Well, in the NBA finals, it's great to have super teams or dynasties or the best of the best, because that's when you get the broadest audience. Casual fans start tuning in more and more as you go through each subsequent round of playoffs until you get to the finals. But I would say that for the rest of the season, that 82 game slog, and it is a slog sometimes, and the early rounds of the playoffs, you want everyone to feel some hope. You don't want that many markets feeling like, yeah, another year we're going to win 32 games and then get a lowish lottery pick. Like you want everybody to feel like they truly have a chance. Adam Silver, when he was deputy commissioner in 2011 during the lockout, had this mantra that is embedded in all our brains who covered the lockout, because he said it every single time when we talked to them. But he said, we want a league where 30 teams, if well managed, have a chance to compete for a championship. And that was the idea, was like not have this extreme polarization where big markets could afford all the talent and small markets were constantly losing the talent. You wanted some stability, you wanted some belief in all those markets. So my belief, like, I think there's a limit. I think at a certain point the parity becomes almost like right now it's kind of it's weird. I don't know what to think of it. It's so even. But I do think that you need a league where small markets feel like they've got a shot, where it's not always we can't compete with LA and New York and Chicago or San Francisco or whatever because they have bigger TV contracts and because they're more attractive to players. You need some semblance of belief and an ability for those markets to compete.
And I want to go off that quickly. I just want to run through some of the series before I let you go.
Sure.
And obviously, the Suns lost to the Nuggets last night. What were some of your key takeaways from that series? And maybe who do you think the Nuggets would prefer to play in the next round, either Golden State or the Lakers?
From the moment the Suns got Kevin Durant, and everybody was ready to crown them, if not NBA champions, at least Western Conference favorites. And I think they're a favorite, but not the favorite. And I was a pump the brakes guy on this one, because what happened when they made the trade for Durant was they lost all their depth, all their room for error, and they were only going to have Durant for a maximum of maybe 20 games, which turned out to be only 8 games in the regular season because he was hurt. And I kept saying to folks, like, this just doesn't seem like enough time. If chemistry matters at all, you need more time. So lo and behold, we get to the playoffs where, they had a pretty tough series against the Clippers, who were banged up, but they got out of that one. And then they go against the Nuggets team that is fully healthy, has some depth, has been together for years and knows each other well. And here the Suns are trying to get by with, 2 great scorers, Durant and Booker. And then, all right, Ayton's good. Chris Paul's up there in years. And then, my God, nothing after that. Like the drop off, Monty Williams didn't know who to play. He never got a chance to establish a rotation. Their bench is depleted. I don't think there's anything surprising about that way that series ended up, frankly. The Suns have a lot of work to do in the offseason, and I think they always were going to have a lot of work to do. And so I'm not surprised by the outcome there. Who would the Nuggets rather play? It's a fun question. I would say probably the Warriors, because for a simple reason, the Lakers have Anthony Davis and the Warriors don't, right? Like, I'm sure, I haven't gone and looked. I don't know how Kevon Looney's traditionally done against Jokic, but Anthony Davis is one of the best defenders and certainly one of the best big man defenders in the NBA. I think I might rather, if I'm the Nuggets, I'm trying to avoid Anthony Davis because he might be somebody who's going to corral Jokic a little bit better, and who Jokic or somebody is going to have to deal with. Whereas with the Warriors, like, they're not going through Kevon Looney, so Jokic doesn't have to worry about guarding Kevon Looney. You try to keep him off the glass, which Jokic is capable of doing. So off the top of my head, that's the way I see it.
And to go to the Lakers versus Golden State, I know you really believe in this Warriors team. How likely do you think they win tonight and come back and win this series?
I never count them out. I never count out a team with Steph Curry on it, but I always have this rule that, never bet against LeBron. And so these principles are coming into severe conflict right now. For all kinds of reasons, I'd like to see the Warriors at least extend it to a game 7. Game 7s are fun. This may be the last time we see Steph and LeBron do this, right? Like, they'll play in the regular season again, but there was never a given they were going to face off in the postseason again anyway after the 4 straight finals. And even if people were sick of it after a while, it's kind of fun to be able to come back to it. That it's happening in a second round matchup is a little strange. But if this is the last time we get to see them play for these kinds of stakes, might as well go 7. And I tend to think like the Warriors, it's the whole Rudy Tomjanovich line about never underestimate the heart of a champion. That's kind of the way I view them. There's a certain aura about the Warriors that I find sometimes irrationally so, but I find like it's hard to not believe in them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And last night, I was thinking about questions to ask you about the postmortem of the Boston Celtics and Jason Tatum, and because of his terrible start to the game 6, and then they came back and won. Do you think the Celtics figured something out against the 76ers by starting Robert Williams, and what can the 76ers do to adjust in game 7?
Yeah, I don't, it's an interesting, it was an interesting wrinkle and an interesting outcome. We could have been having a much different conversation though, and you would have been asking a much different question. Like, Tatum catches fire late. If he hadn't, it would have been, well, they made the adjustment and it didn't work, or it backfired, or you know what I mean? Like, it seemed to have given them a boot. I mean, listen, it was a really low scoring game, so it clearly helped them out defensively against Embiid and Harden. So the premise holds regardless. But if Tatum doesn't catch fire late after a horrible game prior to that, then we're having a different conversation. I don't know. I don't know what the counter is there for the Sixers. It's Robert Williams and Al Horford together certainly present a much more difficult or just stiffer resistance for Joel Embiid, and you want to start there. But yeah, I don't know. I really haven't thought that far ahead on it. I don't know what Doc's next move is, but I will be curious to see if there's a counter adjustment, or if you think, you know what, we were in position to win this game anyway if we just don't give up a couple threes to Tatum late. We'll see.
I want to, before I let you go, ask you about the Knicks and Heat. And that series has been really competitive. And also, it must be nice for you living in New York and covering that team for many years to finally see them be successful. But what are the chances the Knicks come back and win tonight and maybe push it to a game 7?
I've been to more playoff games without having to leave home this spring than since I moved to New York 19 years ago, because I went to a couple of Nets games in the first round against the Sixers. I went to one of the Knicks Cavaliers. Anyway, 2, I think there were 3 here, right? I think I went to 2 of the 3 Knicks Cavs games. And then I went to I've been to all 3 of the games against the Heat. So this is but it's crazy to think this is by far the most playoff games I've seen in New York since I got here 19 years ago. But I suspect this is probably coming to an end. This ride's coming to an end for the Knicks. Jimmy Butler's the best player in the series. The Heat have been fantastic at home, and while I admire what the Knicks have been able to do, they just feel like a team that's got a little bit more volatility to them and a little bit less solid of an identity. And yeah, I just can't. I don't see the Heat losing a home game to them.
No, I definitely see that as well. And I'm going to be mean to you, Howard, because I know you hate predictions. And I want to ask you, I want to ask you, just in terms of right now, as we stand today, who do you think will be the matchup in the finals, and who do you have winning the title?
I think before the season started, I think I was in like the Did I say Bucks Clippers? I might have been in the Bucks Clippers camp before the season started. And I can't even remember that for sure. There's somewhere on the web a prediction that I don't care about. And then I probably, like, before the postseason started, I think I would have gone Boston and almost by default the Warriors, because I just had too many doubts about the rest of them. I had some doubts about the Nuggets. Apologies to the Nuggets, but I had some doubts about them. I had definitely, as you have already heard today, had doubts about the Suns. The Lakers had a really steep mountain to climb. I didn't trust the Clippers and the state of their health by the time the postseason arrived. Didn't trust the Grizzlies or the Kings. So it was like, by default, it was almost like, well, listen, as I've already noted, like I have a hard time not believing in the Warriors. And as despite a wonky season, they have done a great job of pulling themselves back together. They were finally whole. So I would have said Warriors Celtics in a rematch. And certainly once the Bucks got knocked out by Miami, I thought, well, there we go. Celtics are they're waltzing to the finals. Well,
we'll see.
Not so much waltzing by the Celtics. They need waltz lessons, I guess. Look, they're still in a position to do this. Clearly, I think the Celtics, if they come out of this series, whoever comes out of the series, Philly or Boston, they're beating Miami or New York, right? So I'm gonna try to stay slightly consistent. I'll still lean Boston on the Eastern Conference side. On the West, I mean,
the Nuggets look good.
The Nuggets look really good. I do think so. To this point, like, the Nuggets have not faced either a LeBron and Anthony Davis combination who've won a championship, or a Steph Curry Warriors who have won 4 championships together. Like, the Nuggets have had the luxury, in some sense, of, like, as a number 1 seed, you get the walkover first round. And then in the second round, they got a very flawed and beat up Suns team. I don't know that the Nuggets have truly been tested. This is not asterisk creating, by the way. I'm not diminishing anything. Every year, somebody gets a little bit of an easier path based on matchups and health and all that stuff. So I'm not diminishing what the Nuggets have done. I'm just saying, as impressive as this run has been so far, it will be, as it should be, I think, a much higher degree of difficulty against either the Warriors or the Lakers. So I don't know. I guess as we sit here now, hours away from the Warriors potentially being eliminated, I'm still going to say Warriors. I'm going to still say Warriors Celtics in a rematch, and I will probably be wrong on at least one, if not both of those.
Well, thank you so much, Howard, for taking the time and coming on. I really do appreciate it. And I just wanted to give you the floor. What are you working on going forward at GQ or at the Locked On Network that people should stay tuned for?
Yeah, so I'm a regular contributor to the Locked On Podcast Network, which covers every NBA team. And so I'm on multiple shows per week on some of the team-specific shows, and also the national show on Mondays, Locked On NBA. So you can hear me in way too many places on the network there right now. My writing is at the moment for GQ. I'm a contributor for GQ Sports. That's at gq.com. I also have an Authory page, which is like the word author with a Y on the end, authory.com/Howard Beck. Anything that I write for GQ, all of my past stuff for Sports Illustrated and the New York Times and Bleacher Report is all there as well. And yeah, much more to come in the weeks ahead as we go through the finals.
Well, I hope that your prediction goes well, and then that the Warriors come back and win, and that you get to head out to the Bay Area, sorry. And I really appreciate you taking the time. I know it's a busy time, Howard, so I really appreciate it, and thanks so much for coming on.
My absolute pleasure, Alex. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for all the great questions, and thanks for having me. Appreciate it.